May 1945. The war in Europe is over, but the silence that follows sounds nothing like peace. The air in the German countryside still smells of smoke and iodine, of burned fields and hospital disinfectant. Inside a makeshift ward in a half-ruined schoolhouse near Frankfurt, German nurses move between rows of cots. Thin figures in worn uniforms, faces pale from hunger and sleeplessness. Their hands tremble as they change bandages on soldiers who no longer have a country to fight for. Outside, the hum of engines grows louder, not the mechanical thunder of bombers, but a softer sound. American jeeps approaching, their tires rolling carefully over broken glass and gravel. The nurses freeze. For years they've been told the Americans were devils in human skin. They expect punishment, humiliation, perhaps worse. But when the doors open, it isn't soldiers who step inside first, it's women. American Red Cross nurses in crisp uniforms, faces dusted with powder and sunlight. One of them smiles, pulls something small from her pocket, and hands it to a German nurse. A bright red lipstick. The German woman stares at it, speechless. The war had taken everything, and suddenly, color had returned. The moment was small, but it would mark the beginning of something much larger. A quiet revolution of kindness that would reshape a broken nation. By early May 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities that had once pulsed with life, Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, were reduced to rubble, their streets littered with the remnants of a world at war. The German army had surrendered unconditionally, and millions of soldiers were either prisoners or scattered across devastated towns. In the midst of this collapse, the civilian population faced a grim reality: hunger, disease, and the psychological toll of defeat. Women became the pillars of a nation that no longer had a functioning military or economy. They were nurses in hastily converted schools and factories, widows scavenging for food, and mothers trying to shield children from the stark, unrelenting evidence of loss. Their work was relentless. Hospitals were overcrowded with wounded soldiers whose injuries were worsened by malnutrition and untreated infections. There were no medicines left in many regions. The shelves of once proud pharmacies stood empty or looted. Electricity was sporadic, water scarce, and sanitation often non-existent. Throughout the Third Reich, propaganda had portrayed the Allies as merciless invaders, monsters intent on subjugating the German people. For years, women had heard stories of atrocities, imagined horrors, and threats of punishment. Fear had become a daily companion, one as constant as the ache of hunger or the sting of cold winter nights. Yet now, in the war's immediate aftermath, that fear confronted a reality far different from the images drilled into them. The Allied occupation was organized in sectors, each controlled by the United States, Britain, France, or the Soviet Union. In the American zone, military governance began almost immediately. Soldiers arrived with orders, but also with a focus on re-establishing public health, restoring morale, and introducing humanitarian aid. American Red Cross and Army nurses, often young women barely older than the German nurses themselves, were among the first to enter hospitals and wards. They carried not only medical supplies, but the faint traces of a world that still functioned, a world beyond defeat. These women brought uniforms that were clean and well-pressed, rationed but sufficient food, and small tokens that symbolized dignity in a broken landscape. In a ward where every day had been marked by the monotony of pain, the sight of an American nurse adjusting her cap, offering a soft word, or simply smiling, felt alien. For German nurses, trained to maintain strict discipline and patient detachment, the encounter was disorienting. They had expected inspections, threats, or scorn, Instead, they found gestures of kindness. The psychological environment of these post-war hospitals was complex. Nurses juggled exhaustion, moral uncertainty, and the lingering weight of guilt and responsibility. Many had tended soldiers who were part of a war machine responsible for unimaginable destruction. Yet they had done their duty in a medical sense, providing care where possible. Now, faced with women from the former enemy nation, they encountered a paradox. Enemies who behaved with empathy, even camaraderie. Small acts, sharing a piece of chocolate, offering a cigarette, a casual laugh, began to chip away at the rigid barrier of fear. Simultaneously, the American nurses were conscious of the delicate balance they had to maintain. Their presence was not merely humanitarian, it was strategic. Allied military planners understood that the occupation required more than tanks and weapons. Winning the psychological battle was critical to preventing resistance and rebuilding German society along democratic lines. The Red Cross women and other American female staff became silent agents in this cultural shift. Their uniforms, their tidiness, even their use of cosmetics like lipstick, carried messages of normalcy, civility, and perhaps most importantly, trust. Across these wards and small hospitals, trust did not arrive all at once. Many German nurses observed the Americans with cautious eyes, prepared to retreat behind skepticism or resentment. Yet human instinct responded to care and friendliness in ways that propaganda could not fully suppress. Conversations began to emerge, hesitant at first, about shared experiences. The long nights, the loss of family, the exhaustion of endless caregiving. In these moments, the walls erected by years of conflict began to crack. The stage was set for encounters that would resonate far beyond the immediate hospital walls. The smallest gestures, a hand on a shoulder, a gentle correction of a patient's posture, or the unexpected offering of a cosmetic item, became symbolic acts of reconciliation. German nurses, who had seen lives shattered and hopes extinguished, were introduced to a notion that the world could still hold small kindnesses. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but it laid the foundation for a post-war narrative in which human empathy could transcend former enmities. These first days in the American-occupied hospitals were crucial. They were the beginning of an interaction where the cultural, moral, and emotional dimensions of war would confront one another directly. For German nurses, this was not merely about survival. It was about reclaiming identity in a society that had been stripped of certainty and honor. For the American women, it was an opportunity to demonstrate the values of a victorious nation: order, compassion, and a belief in rebuilding rather than punishing. The contrast between the gray, shattered world the German nurses had known and the vibrancy, subtle but unmistakable, brought by American women would leave a lasting impression. It was here, in these early interactions, that lipstick and laughter began to become instruments of psychological reconstruction, sowing the seeds for moments that would stun and transform those who had endured the unimaginable. By late May 1945, the American occupation forces were fully established across large swaths of Western Germany. Their arrival was both orderly and meticulous. Military trucks carried not only soldiers, but also teams of nurses, clerks, and support staff, all prepared to administer food, medical care, and governance. In towns and villages, civilians emerged cautiously from basements and shattered homes, unsure whether these newcomers were to be feared or welcomed. Among the first to navigate this uneasy landscape were American women in uniform. Red Cross nurses, Army nurses, and auxiliary personnel were assigned to hospitals, refugee centers, and displaced persons camps. They were young, trained, and often carrying their first real exposure to the front lines of a defeated nation. Their presence was striking to German observers. The uniforms were clean and pressed, the demeanor calm but confident, and the voices carried a warmth that was foreign in a land accustomed to rigid hierarchy and fear of authority. German nurses, still recovering from the psychological strain of total war, initially approached with hesitation. Many were haunted by what they had seen. The faces of dying soldiers, the empty homes of families lost to bombings, the endless lines at ration stations. Years of Nazi indoctrination had painted Americans as cruel conquerors. Yet what greeted them was radically different: an insistence on professionalism, patience, and subtle compassion. The Americans did not lecture. They assisted. They did not demand obedience. They offered guidance. The arrival of American women was not merely a practical necessity. It was a cultural shock. In hospitals, they introduced small rituals of care previously foreign to the German nurses. The careful arrangement of linens, the gentle encouragement of patients to move or eat, and notably, the subtle use of cosmetics. Lipstick, powder, and neatly combed hair signaled a normalcy that the German women had thought lost. In a setting dominated by gray uniforms, exhaustion, and the smell of disinfectant, these small touches were profound. They symbolized life beyond survival, a world where dignity could exist even amid ruin. Communication was cautious at first. Language barriers and years of propagandized fear slowed dialogue, but human gestures transcended words. An American nurse would hand a cup of tea to a German patient, offer a smile to a weary colleague, or gently adjust a blanket. And slowly, the rigid suspicion began to soften. German nurses began to speak in whispers about these differences: the kindness, the laughter, the unexpected warmth. Each small act chipped away at the mental walls built over years of indoctrination. Beyond hospitals, American women engaged with German civilians in broader settings. Food distribution centers, refugee camps, and temporary shelters became venues for quiet cultural exchanges. Red Cross packages included not only sustenance, but also hygiene items, chocolate, and occasionally small tokens of beauty: combs, scarves, or lipstick. These items, seemingly trivial, were psychologically potent. In a society stripped of luxury, control, and autonomy, the ability to apply lipstick or brush hair became an assertion of identity and self-worth. For the German nurses, the most striking moments were often simple and spontaneous. A shared laugh over a patient's stubbornness, a surprised reaction to a friendly gesture, or the act of passing along a cosmetic item to someone in despair. These moments disrupted the rigid hierarchy of enemy and ally. Fear gave way to curiosity, and curiosity gradually blossomed into trust. Observers noted the transformation. Women who had once moved silently through halls, heads bowed and eyes downcast, began to hold themselves with renewed poise, even glancing into mirrors again, brushing hair, adjusting collars. The American women, for their part, were aware of the symbolic weight of their actions. Each smile, each offering of lipstick, each gentle conversation was a calculated but genuine effort to restore not only health, but also the sense of humanity that war had eroded. They were instruments of soft power, proving that victory could be expressed through compassion rather than dominance. Their professionalism and empathy became a bridge over the chasm of fear and prejudice, demonstrating that reconciliation could begin at the personal level. By the end of the first month of occupation, the psychological landscape had shifted subtly but unmistakably. German nurses began to document these experiences in diaries and letters. The astonishment at small kindnesses, the relief at encountering someone who treated them as human, not enemy. The seeds of a larger cultural transformation were planted in these interactions. Hospitals and wards became spaces of cautious optimism, where laughter, once thought impossible, began to reappear alongside the clinical routines of care. These early encounters also hinted at a deeper potential, that gestures as simple as lipstick and laughter could catalyze broader societal healing. In a country fractured by ideology, destruction, and loss, the presence of women from the former enemy nation offered a counter-narrative. They demonstrated that empathy could survive even in the wake of total war, that human connection could transcend the divisions enforced by propaganda and fear. The stage was now fully set. The contrast between the defeated, shadowed German nurses and the vibrant, confident American women would soon produce moments of profound emotional resonance. Acts of care and small pleasures would grow into a movement of quiet reclamation, transforming despair into dignity, fear into trust, and war's lingering darkness into the first hints of hope. The human dimension of these encounters was immediate and undeniable. German nurses had spent years tending to suffering, often under impossible conditions, while the very institutions meant to support them had crumbled. They were exhausted, fearful, and psychologically fragile. When American women entered their world, bringing small comforts and warmth, the contrast struck like sunlight piercing clouds. For the first time, they were treated not as enemies, not as defeated remnants of a lost cause, but as human beings worthy of attention and care. A shared smile, a gentle touch on the shoulder, or a whispered word of encouragement became a lifeline in a landscape otherwise defined by loss. These moments were brief, yet they carried weight far beyond their duration. For many German nurses, it was the first recognition that life, dignity, and humanity could exist outside the shadows of war. The gender perspective amplified the impact of these encounters. Women on both sides had endured unique trials. German nurses had worked under extreme duress, often caring for soldiers who represented a regime they could not oppose, while American women had entered foreign territory, fully aware of the hostilities that once existed. The meeting of women across enemy lines created an intimate, transformative space. They were not soldiers facing each other with rifles, but caregivers sharing a common understanding of exhaustion, fear, and perseverance. Lipstick, laughter, and small acts of attentiveness became silent signals of solidarity. For German nurses, observing American women maintaining composure, grace, and kindness in a hostile and unfamiliar environment sparked a complex mixture of awe, envy, and inspiration. The experience challenged long-held notions of enemy and ally, proving that common humanity could emerge even from the most polarized circumstances. The symbolic power of everyday items became central to this narrative. Lipstick, perhaps the most striking emblem, was more than a cosmetic. In a society stripped of luxury and aesthetic pleasure, a tube of color represented autonomy, personal dignity, and identity. When an American nurse offered lipstick to a German colleague, it was a gesture laden with psychological resonance. It communicated, silently but forcefully, that self-expression was permissible, that one's body and face could still assert individuality despite years of deprivation and war. Hair combs, scarves, and neatly folded uniforms carried similar messages, subtle yet potent, bridging the gulf between defeat and the possibility of self-reclamation. In an environment where moral and social codes had been upended, these simple tools became catalysts for small but profound shifts in behavior and self-perception. From a tactical and military perspective, these interactions were carefully managed. The American occupation forces recognized that rebuilding infrastructure alone was insufficient. Morale, obedience, and social cohesion were essential to maintaining order and preventing unrest. By deploying women in visible, influential roles within hospitals and public facilities, they created a form of soft power. These women modeled civility, discipline, and empathy, demonstrating an alternative form of authority rooted not in fear, but in respect and competence. German nurses, observing and sometimes emulating these behaviors, began internalizing patterns of professionalism and care that subtly undermined the legacy of authoritarian control. This was psychological reconstruction as much as it was medical, a deliberate effort to reshape society from the inside out. Leadership, both formal and informal, played a critical role. American women carried the imprimatur of military authority, yet their approach was strikingly different from traditional command. They led by example, exhibiting patience, competence, and calm. German nurses, many of whom had been trained under strict hierarchical systems, responded to this model in ways that formal decrees could not achieve. The ability to influence behavior through kindness and professionalism challenged existing notions of power. Small, everyday decisions, how to tend to a patient, how to interact with colleagues, how to maintain composure, became subtle lessons in leadership that would ripple across wards, hospitals, and communities. The influence of American women extended beyond medical care, shaping social norms and expectations for behavior in a devastated society. The enemy perspective, surprisingly, became a lens for self-reflection. German nurses, accustomed to viewing Americans as cruel and unrelenting, found their assumptions repeatedly contradicted. Each encounter was a test. A cup of tea offered, a reassuring word, or a moment of shared laughter forced a reassessment of identity and morality. The former enemy was now a mirror, reflecting possibilities for dignity, cooperation, and mutual respect. This shift in perception was neither immediate nor uniform, but it laid the foundation for post-war reconciliation at the personal level, long before formal political agreements were enacted. The realization that enemies could behave with empathy and integrity challenged the simplistic narratives ingrained by propaganda and fear. The moral dimension was perhaps the most subtle but enduring. In a society grappling with collective guilt, defeat, and devastation, witnessing acts of generosity from those once deemed adversaries catalyzed ethical reflection. Small gestures, sharing food, offering comfort, or providing a simple cosmetic, became moral statements. They communicated that compassion and humanity could survive even amid catastrophe. German nurses absorbed these lessons, and in doing so, began to reconstruct not only their own ethical frameworks, but also the cultural norms of the communities they would continue to serve. In these exchanges, the war's most enduring lesson emerged: that empathy and dignity could be preserved and transmitted, even across lines once drawn in blood and fear. The convergence of these angles, human, gendered, symbolic, tactical, leadership, enemy, and moral, created a complex, layered environment in which simple acts of care resonated far beyond the immediate moment. Lipstick and laughter, small yet profound, became instruments of reconstruction, psychological and social, helping women reclaim autonomy, dignity, and hope. The impact was felt quietly, subtly, yet the reverberations would be long-lasting, shaping both individual lives and broader cultural narratives in the occupied zones of post-war Germany. Beyond the initial human and symbolic impact, the military and administrative framework of the American occupation magnified the effect of these interactions. The U.S. Army recognized early that restoring order required more than enforcing curfews or distributing rations. Civilians, particularly women who had maintained hospitals and cared for the wounded, represented the backbone of social stability. By embedding American women in visible, trusted roles as nurses, administrators, and Red Cross workers. The Allies fostered a climate where everyday behavior became an instrument of reconstruction. German nurses observed how these women managed chaotic wards, coordinated supplies, and maintained composure under stress. Through these examples, they absorbed models of efficiency and ethical conduct, which subtly undermined the authoritarian structures previously ingrained in them. Cultural contrasts reinforced these lessons. American women embodied a different vision of femininity, composed, articulate, and unafraid to express kindness or authority simultaneously. In post-war Germany, austerity had suppressed outward expressions of selfhood, particularly among women constrained by fear, deprivation, and rigid social expectations. The introduction of makeup, neatly maintained uniforms, and small gestures of personal attention was therefore revolutionary. Lipstick was not merely cosmetic. It was a declaration that the individual self could exist and even flourish in the aftermath of totalitarianism. German nurses, accustomed to seeing their own femininity co-opted by ideology, were confronted with an alternative, a way to assert identity without defiance or subversion, a path to reclaim dignity through ordinary acts. The interaction of gender and power had profound implications for social reconstruction. In these hospitals and wards, authority was not imposed by threat, but demonstrated through competence, empathy, and professionalism. German nurses internalized these lessons, observing that respect could be commanded without fear, and collaboration could be achieved without coercion. The presence of American women, particularly those leading teams of caregivers, provided living evidence that leadership and influence were compatible with compassion. This model challenged decades of socialization, in which authority was inseparable from hierarchy and dominance, and offered a blueprint for rebuilding both medical and civil institutions. Technological and logistical factors also played a subtle role. American units arrived with supplies, standardized procedures, and organizational methods that contrasted sharply with the scarcity and improvisation that German nurses had endured. Even minor interventions, a well-stocked medicine cart, a clean linen supply, or a methodical record-keeping system, communicated stability and control. These systems, combined with the personal interactions of the women administering them, fostered trust in both processes and people. German nurses, initially skeptical, began to integrate these practices into their daily routines, improving patient outcomes and reinforcing the credibility of American authority. In this way, practical aid and psychological reassurance were inseparable, each reinforcing the other. The broader societal angle also emerged from these interactions. Hospitals and refugee centers became microcosms for post-war reconciliation, where propaganda once dictated hatred and fear. Everyday cooperation introduced a new narrative. That former enemies could interact with civility, that kindness could be offered without ulterior motive, and that shared humanity transcended political and military divisions. German nurses, initially astonished, slowly participated in this cultural exchange, learning not only the mechanics of care but also the ethics of compassion. The act of accepting lipstick, a simple gift of color and self-expression, symbolized a willingness to engage with the new moral order. It was a quiet endorsement of reconciliation, one gesture at a time. Ethical reflection was intertwined with the survival. The war had imposed moral ambiguity on every aspect of life. Choices were rarely clear, and responsibilities often conflicted with personal conscience. The American women, through their conduct, offered a model of ethical consistency. Their actions demonstrated that one could provide care without judgment, enforce rules without cruelty, and extend humanity without expectation of repayment. For German nurses, witnessing this approach became a moral education in itself. It provided a tangible example of integrity and professional ethics, contrasting sharply with the coercion and moral compromise many had endured under the Third Reich. Psychological studies later confirmed the significance of these encounters. Small, seemingly trivial interactions, a shared laugh, the offer of a cosmetic or a moment of reassurance, had measurable effects on stress reduction, morale, and self-esteem among German women. The introduction of predictable, compassionate behavior into chaotic environments reduced anxiety, enhanced cooperation, and created the conditions for more sustained social recovery. These effects were subtle but cumulative, laying the groundwork for both personal and institutional reconstruction in the months and years that followed. Finally, the moral dimension extended into the broader narrative of post-war Europe. These interactions illustrated that reconciliation was possible at the most human level, independent of formal treaties or political agreements. By demonstrating empathy, dignity, and respect in everyday acts, American women became catalysts for a process that would eventually shape German attitudes toward their former occupiers and toward the broader world. The lipstick, the laughter, the careful attention. Each minor gesture was a brick in a psychological bridge connecting nations and redefining enemy and ally as roles of circumstance rather than inherent identity. Through the convergence of these angles, military, cultural, gendered, technological, ethical, psychological, and moral, the scene was set for the decisive moments that would follow. The combination of structured support and spontaneous humanity created a fertile environment for transformation, preparing German nurses and their communities to experience the turning points that would redefine their lives and the nation itself. It was June 1945 when the transformation began to crystallize. In a field hospital near Mainz, the hum of distant traffic mingled with the soft groans of recovering soldiers. German nurses, still gaunt from months of rationing and sleepless nights, moved between cots with practiced precision. Their hands were steady, but their eyes betrayed the exhaustion of years at the edge of survival. Into this space walked a small team of American women, Red Cross nurses and Army auxiliaries, carrying boxes of supplies and quietly a sense of calm authority. The moment was deceptively simple. A young American nurse, her uniform spotless and her cap perfectly adjusted, approached a German nurse who was tending to a particularly grievous wound. Without a word, she handed her a small tube of lipstick. The German nurse froze, her fingers brushing the paper packaging with disbelief. In that instant, the war's vast machinery, battles, bombings, propaganda, and loss, seemed to recede, replaced by the intimate language of care and recognition. A tentative smile appeared, hesitant but genuine. Around them, others watched, curiosity replacing the habitual fear that had dominated months of interaction with occupying forces. Word spread quickly. Across wards and hospitals, German nurses began receiving similar gestures. Fresh uniforms folded neatly, combs, soap, and occasional morsels of chocolate. These were not commands or inspections. They were acts of choice, voluntary and generous. Laughter, once suppressed by constant stress and trauma, began to emerge in small bursts. A nurse would chuckle at an American colleague's playful comment or share a whispered joke with a patient, startling in its spontaneity. The sound of human amusement, so long absent, echoed against the sterile walls and shattered windows, creating an atmosphere almost foreign in its warmth. One particularly striking moment occurred in a hospital in Wiesbaden. German nurses had gathered for a routine briefing when a group of American women arrived, carrying a makeshift vanity table. They placed mirrors, brushes, and cosmetics on the table and invited the German nurses to sit. Many hesitated, wary of appearing frivolous in a setting dominated by suffering and scarcity. Slowly, Curiosity overcame reluctance. Fingers brushed against powder. Lips were painted with the first color in months, and the nurses caught glimpses of themselves in the mirrors. Some smiled tentatively, others laughed outright, a sound that had not echoed through the wards for years. In that brief, seemingly trivial act, fear gave way to humanity, exhaustion to renewed self-perception. These gestures were not mere entertainment, they were acts of psychological reclamation. For German nurses, whose identities had been constricted by wartime duty and ideological pressure, the ability to choose, to express themselves, and to engage in lightheartedness was revolutionary. The lipstick, the laughter, and the playful attention were symbolic declarations. Survival was no longer merely physical. It could be emotional, moral, and aesthetic. American women had introduced the notion that the human spirit, even under the weight of defeat, could be nourished and reclaimed. In parallel, American leaders observed the effect with deliberate interest. Reports circulated up the chain of command, noting that German nurses who engaged in these activities exhibited improved morale, increased efficiency, and more cooperative behavior with staff and patients. These outcomes were not coincidental. The combination of structured care, gentle discipline, and humane interaction had created an environment in which former enemies began to trust and emulate positive behaviors. Small, voluntary acts of generosity became levers of influence, reshaping both professional practice and social norms. The psychological breakthrough was compounded by repetition. Each day, similar scenes unfolded. A German nurse receiving a freshly laundered uniform, a conversation over a cup of tea, or the opportunity to apply makeup at a vanity shared with American colleagues. Fear and suspicion. The residue of propaganda and trauma diminished incrementally. By mid-July, nurses reported feeling a sense of agency they had not experienced since the early days of occupation. They began mentoring junior staff, organizing small recreational moments for patients, and rediscovering a sense of community that had been suppressed by fear and deprivation. It was not only individual transformation that occurred. Entire wards shifted in atmosphere. Once silent corridors now carried murmurs of conversation, shared jokes, and occasional bursts of laughter. Patients, witnessing these changes, responded in kind. Soldiers who had endured the trauma of defeat found themselves in an environment that encouraged dignity, comfort, and even levity. The ripple effect of these interventions extended beyond the nurses themselves, touching patients, colleagues, and the broader hospital culture. By the end of the summer, a recognizable pattern had emerged. German nurses who had initially approached American women with caution now actively sought their guidance, advice, and companionship. The introduction of simple, human gestures, a smile, a tube of lipstick, a shared laugh, had become catalysts for profound transformation. The barriers erected by years of war, fear, and propaganda were being dismantled, one deliberate act at a time. This turning point, subtle yet decisive, illustrated a broader truth, that in the wake of total conflict, the reconstruction of human dignity could be as vital as the reconstruction of cities. The actions of a few women, armed not with weapons, but with compassion, skill, and small symbols of normalcy, reshaped the emotional landscape of a defeated nation. In the quiet wards and corridors of post-war Germany, they demonstrated that victory could be expressed not through domination, but through empathy, generosity, and shared humanity. And in this unfolding transformation, the stage was set for a deeper, more widespread awakening, one that would extend beyond hospitals, into communities, and eventually into the very fabric of German society. The momentum of change spread beyond individual wards, reaching hospitals and communities across the American-occupied zones. German nurses, initially astonished by the simple gestures of American women, began to internalize new norms of behavior. Professionalism, empathy, and self-expression intertwined in ways that challenged deeply ingrained habits. In one hospital near Frankfurt, nurses organized a small gathering in the break room. Sharing the lipstick, scarves, and combs given to them, laughter echoed off cracked plaster walls, mingling with the faint scent of antiseptic and sun-warmed laundry. Patients paused to observe, eyes widening at the unfamiliar display of camaraderie and joy. These moments were more than symbolic. They were transformative. German nurses discovered that small acts of choice could restore agency in a life previously constrained by war and occupation. Applying lipstick, arranging hair, or simply choosing to smile became subtle assertions of selfhood. The American women had introduced tools for reclaiming identity, demonstrating that humanity could survive even in environments defined by destruction and loss. With each passing day, more nurses embraced these gestures, creating an expanding network of personal restoration that moved beyond individual experience into a collective awakening. Psychological resilience was reinforced by ritual. Every morning, American nurses arrived with not only medical supplies, but also encouragement. They modeled patience, thoroughness, and care, showing that efficiency did not preclude kindness. German nurses absorbed these behaviors, gradually integrating them into their routines. By August, the transformation was visible. Patients received more attentive care, conversations flowed more naturally, and morale visibly improved. Even those who had remained skeptical or withdrawn were subtly influenced, responding to consistent patterns of professionalism and empathy. In displaced persons camps, similar dynamics unfolded. American women oversaw the distribution of rations and medical aid, often engaging directly with German staff and civilians. The inclusion of small comforts, chocolate, soap, or a brush, acted as psychological punctuation, punctuating the hardships of daily life with moments of care. German nurses, initially wary, began to recognize patterns. These gestures were consistent, sincere, and devoid of ulterior motive. Trust grew, and with it, a tentative sense of collaboration. The boundaries between enemy and ally blurred, replaced by shared human experience. The ripple effect extended to leadership and decision-making. German nurses who had observed American women in supervisory roles began to emulate their methods. They learned to balance authority with empathy, to communicate instructions without intimidation, and to maintain morale under pressure. This adoption of new leadership models had profound implications for the post-war reconstruction of healthcare. It demonstrated that power could be exercised responsibly, and that influence could be earned through competence and compassion rather than fear. An emblematic moment occurred during a routine hospital inspection. A German head nurse, initially resistant to American oversight, witnessed a colleague receiving a small gift of lipstick and smiling openly. Instead of reprimanding the nurse or dismissing the gesture, the head nurse paused, observing the interaction with quiet reflection. Slowly, she nodded, understanding that dignity, morale, and efficiency were not mutually exclusive. She began to incorporate these lessons into her own supervisory style, encouraging staff to maintain composure, kindness, and attention to patient comfort alongside clinical duties. In this moment, the principles introduced by the American women became institutionalized, extending beyond individual acts into lasting professional practice. The cultural significance of these interactions cannot be overstated. In a nation grappling with collective guilt, the visible humanity of former enemies offered a model for reconciliation. The American women's behavior undermined entrenched stereotypes and challenged assumptions about morality ethics, and conduct. Lipstick, laughter, and small acts of generosity became symbols of a broader ethical framework. That kindness could coexist with authority, and that empathy could be exercised even after years of conflict. German nurses, internalizing these lessons, became agents of cultural transmission, passing along new norms to patients, colleagues, and communities. By the autumn of 1945, the transformation was unmistakable. Hospitals that had once been silent, tense, and grim now resonated with conversation, laughter, and subtle displays of individuality. German nurses were no longer merely surviving. They were beginning to reclaim their humanity. The American women, through consistent behavior and attention to detail, had catalyzed a psychological turning point. This shift would ripple outward, influencing family units, neighborhoods, and eventually, broader societal attitudes toward occupation, reconciliation, and post-war life. The climax of these interactions, though quiet and largely undocumented in formal military reports, marked a decisive moment in the reconstruction of post-war Germany. The influence of small, deliberate acts, a tube of lipstick, a shared laugh, a gentle word, demonstrated that human connection could transcend the barriers imposed by years of war, propaganda, and fear. The enemy, once demonized, was now recognized as a potential partner in rebuilding dignity and community. In these wards, camps, and hospitals, the American women had achieved something extraordinary. They had proven that victory could be expressed through empathy, that authority could be exercised with compassion, and that the smallest gestures could catalyze profound social and psychological change. The stage was set for the aftermath, for a country grappling with the ruins of its past to embrace the beginnings of recovery, guided by the lessons embedded in these quiet, transformative moments. The effects of these interactions became increasingly visible in the months following the initial encounters. German nurses who had once moved through hospital corridors with bowed heads and measured steps began to display renewed confidence. Their actions, small but deliberate, rippled outward, influencing colleagues, patients, and the broader communities they served. Observers noted improvements not only in morale, but also in efficiency. Wards operated more smoothly, patients received more attentive care, and the atmosphere, once tense and foreboding, now carried the subtle hum of normalcy. Reports from American officers emphasized the significance of these changes. They documented that nurses who had engaged with American counterparts were more cooperative, empathetic, and willing to embrace new procedures. The introduction of structured routines, combined with gestures of personal attention, created an environment in which psychological and practical reconstruction reinforced one another. In essence, the war's human damage, fear, suspicion, and resignation, was being repaired in real time through the quiet actions of women on both sides of the divide. The broader social consequences were equally important. German nurses, inspired by the American example, began to extend their influence beyond hospital walls. They taught younger staff, guided patients, and participated in community efforts to restore order and dignity. The model of leadership demonstrated through empathy, professionalism, and ethical conduct became contagious. Within a matter of months, the principles that had seemed fragile and aspirational were being applied in daily routines. Attention to hygiene, patient comfort, collaborative teamwork, and the cultivation of morale. American women had also inadvertently reshaped perceptions of gender roles. In a society where women had been expected to endure, obey, and sacrifice silently, the presence of competent, articulate, and confident American counterparts provided a living alternative. German nurses observed that authority need not be harsh or domineering. It could be exercised with compassion and still command respect. They saw that professionalism, competence, and empathy were not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. These lessons would inform the post-war reconstruction of hospitals, schools, and civic institutions, leaving an enduring mark on societal expectations of female leadership. Material contributions played a complementary role. Supplies, whether medical, hygienic, or symbolic, had tangible benefits, but their psychological impact was often greater. A box of fresh uniforms, a comb, a tube of lipstick, or a simple piece of chocolate became emblematic of care and consideration. Each item carried the message that human dignity could exist even amidst scarcity and ruin. For nurses and patients alike, these items reinforced the idea that life could resume its ordinary pleasures, however modest, and that their worth was recognized by those who had once been deemed enemies. The moral dimension of these interactions also became apparent. German nurses, confronted daily with consistent acts of kindness, began to reassess assumptions imposed by years of propaganda and fear. They learned to differentiate between duty and morality, authority and empathy, survival and humanity. In choosing to accept care, collaborate, and participate in moments of joy, they began to reconstruct an ethical framework disrupted by war. These lessons, though subtle, had a profound long-term effect on the psychological recovery of individuals and the moral rebuilding of communities. The occupational policies of the Allies further reinforced these outcomes. American commanders encouraged respectful treatment of civilians and the professional integration of local nurses. They recognized that rebuilding social trust was essential to the stability of the occupation. By empowering women in healthcare roles, supporting cultural exchange, and permitting gestures that restored dignity, the Allies accelerated the normalization of life in post-war Germany. Hospitals, wards, and refugee centers became laboratories of reconstruction, where lessons learned at the interpersonal level would influence broader societal recovery. By the end of 1945, it was clear that the seemingly minor interactions between American and German women had produced measurable, lasting consequences. Wards operated more efficiently, morale was significantly higher, and patients responded more positively to care. German nurses had begun to reclaim a sense of identity, autonomy, and ethical grounding. These changes, born in small acts, a smile, a laugh, a tube of lipstick, demonstrated that human psychology, culture, and social cohesion could be reshaped even after the devastation of total war. The seeds planted in hospital wards were only the beginning. The lessons of empathy, dignity, and mutual respect would spread, influencing community structures, professional standards, and the broader process of reconciliation. The transformation demonstrated that in the aftermath of conflict, reconstruction was not solely a matter of bricks and mortar. It was equally a matter of human connection, trust, and the restoration of personal and collective identity. As 1946 unfolded, the long-term consequences of these early interactions became increasingly evident. German nurses who had initially approached American women with suspicion now acted as conduits for broader cultural and social change. They shared their experiences with colleagues, family members, and communities, slowly reshaping perceptions of the former enemy. The presence of American women had introduced a model of interaction defined by empathy, competence, and dignity. And these values began to permeate daily life in ways both subtle and profound. One striking development was the normalization of self-expression. German nurses, once constrained by fear and scarcity, now took deliberate steps to reclaim personal identity. Lipstick, hair combs, and small gestures of grooming were no longer isolated acts. They became routines integrated into professional and personal life. Patients, observing these changes, responded with renewed engagement and trust. A nurse applying a touch of color to her lips while adjusting a patient's bandages sent a powerful message. Even in defeat, human dignity persisted. These acts, initially minor, reinforced broader patterns of morale and resilience. The influence extended to institutional practices as well. Hospitals began to adopt the operational methods demonstrated by American staff, combining efficiency with compassion. Record-keeping improved, patient care became more attentive, and teamwork was prioritized over rigid hierarchy. German nurses, now confident in applying both professional skill and human sensitivity, became mentors for younger staff. The integration of these practices created a feedback loop. Improved care reinforced morale, which in turn enhanced performance, gradually transforming the entire healthcare environment. Social and cultural impact radiated beyond hospitals. American Women's example provided a blueprint for female leadership, challenging long-standing societal norms. German women observed that authority could coexist with empathy, that professionalism could coexist with warmth, and that influence could be earned through competence rather than coercion. These lessons influenced other sectors, including schools, administrative offices, and community organizations, slowly reshaping expectations for women's roles in post-war German society. Material support continued to reinforce psychological and social reconstruction. Supplies delivered by American personnel, medicine, food, hygiene products, and symbolic items such as lipstick or scarves were integrated into daily routines. They served as reminders that care could be consistent, deliberate, and humane. For nurses, receiving these items became acts of reassurance, reinforcing trust and establishing continuity in an otherwise unstable environment. These gestures, though simple, had measurable effects on morale, cooperation, and resilience. The broader implications for reconciliation were profound. By demonstrating that former enemies could interact respectfully and humanely, American women created a framework for early post-war understanding. German nurses, now participants rather than passive observers, contributed to the erosion of entrenched stereotypes and fear-based assumptions. Their experiences influenced not only immediate social interactions, but also long-term attitudes toward cooperation, empathy, and the possibility of constructive engagement with the wider world. Evidence of this transformation can be seen in diaries, letters, and oral testimonies from the period. Nurses recorded their astonishment at small acts of generosity, the surprise at being treated with kindness, and the emotional impact of gestures once thought impossible in a defeated society. These narratives reveal a consistent theme: that the restoration of dignity, morale, and ethical grounding could be achieved through persistent, personal engagement. Even the smallest gestures, a smile, a word of encouragement, or the offering of lipstick, carried disproportionate weight in reconstructing the human fabric of post-war Germany. By late 1946, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Hospitals that had been centers of fear and exhaustion now embodied order, professionalism, and humanity. German nurses had reclaimed both personal and professional agency, empowered by consistent examples of empathy and competence. The lessons imparted by American women had extended beyond the wards, influencing social expectations, leadership models, and community morale. The early interactions that had once seemed trivial or symbolic had, in fact, catalyzed profound transformation. Ultimately, the aftermath of these encounters demonstrated that the reconstruction of society after total war depended as much on human relationships and moral example as on political treaties or material rebuilding. The work of American women in hospitals, camps, and communities had not only alleviated immediate suffering, but had sown the seeds for long-term psychological, social, and cultural recovery. In these moments, the intersection of small kindnesses and consistent ethical behavior revealed a powerful truth: that even in the aftermath of profound devastation, empathy, dignity, and shared humanity could endure, shaping the course of individual lives and the trajectory of a nation. The story of German nurses and the American women who entered their lives after the war is a reminder that history is not shaped solely by battles and treaties, but by small, deliberate acts of humanity. In the shadow of total destruction, in the corridors of hospitals and refugee centers, dignity was restored, one gesture at a time. A smile, a tube of lipstick, a shared laugh, these simple moments carried weight far beyond their immediate context. They became instruments of psychological and social reconstruction, demonstrating that even after years of fear, propaganda, and loss, trust and empathy could flourish. The significance of these encounters lies not only in the immediate relief they provided, but in the long-term lessons they imparted. German nurses, initially cautious and wary, learned that authority could coexist with compassion, that professionalism could be paired with warmth, and that moral integrity could guide actions even in the most constrained circumstances. The American women, through consistent behavior and attention to small details, offered a living model of ethical leadership and personal dignity. These lessons extended beyond the hospital walls, shaping community interactions, professional standards, and cultural norms in post-war Germany. In a broader sense, this story illustrates the enduring power of human connection. War had imposed division, fear, and suspicion, but reconciliation began in the simplest ways, through shared humor, personal care, and recognition of common humanity. The act of giving lipstick, small though it may seem, symbolized a reclamation of identity, a restoration of autonomy, and a profound assertion of life over defeat. It reminds us that in the aftermath of destruction, the smallest gestures can carry the deepest consequences. Ultimately, the narrative of these women is a testament to resilience, empathy, and the quiet, transformative power of kindness. It shows that history's turning points are not always measured by grand strategies or decisive battles, but often by the courage to reach across divides, to offer care where fear once reigned, and to restore humanity when it is most endangered. In those post-war wards, laughter and lipstick were not trivial. They were revolutionary. And through them, a fractured nation began, piece by piece, to heal.